It started the way most of my nights do, late, quiet, the desk lamp making a pale circle while the rest of the room stayed dark. I had the NOAA feeds pulled through the scanner, band by band, dropping onto tape the way I've done for years. Usually it's weather chatter, channel IDs, the sleepy hum of open space. Nothing to hold on to. But that night, a thin line on the meter caught. Not loud, not sharp, but insistent. A rhythm hovering at the edge of perception, so small I almost skipped over it. I didn't. Something about the steadiness made me settle into the chair and just listen. At first, it sounded like what you'd hear from a weak antenna-distorted static. Faint clicks, uneven. I logged the hour, 33 minutes past 2. The rhythm repeated every few seconds. Too even for lightning bursts, too soft for typical interference. NOAA's documentation suggested the band should have been clear. I whispered into the mic, have to anchor myself. Have to prove memory later. Anomaly detected. Recording live. The source triangulated back in the logs to buoys mid-Atlantic. Their coordinates deep in common traffic, but hardly monitored outside storms. I checked tower relays, nothing unusual there. No reports. Only the anomaly in my headphones, steady and stubborn, riding beneath empty air. I leaned closer, pen tapping the notebook, catching myself breathing in sync with it. Curiosity pushed me to slow the tape. At half speed, the static opened up. What had been noise pulled into a contour. A rise, a fall. Half a second long. It was breath, or close enough to force me up from the chair. I replayed it again, headphones pinched tight, chest tight. Each loop sounded less mechanical, more human. But how could static breathe? I tried filters, narrowing bandwidth, stripping highs, then lows. The core remained. The breath seemed to push through every adjustment, preserved as if the air inside the signal insisted on surviving. I marked every result, the times, the waveform screenshots stuttering across my screen. The page filled with repetitions of the same note. Breath, breath. When I glanced at the spectrogram, something unexpected appeared. Not only vertical bands, but a swelling bloom. The color smear stretched like a lung expanding, or wings unfurling. Shapes not typical to noise. One bloom repeated, broader than the rest, sharp around the edges. My throat dried. I shifted the settings, asked the screen if the machine was tricking me, if my eyes created familiar forms out of chaos. But the bloom held. It stayed even when I re-recorded the passage. Every other band I tested along NOAA's registry showed silence. Predictable waves broken only by the familiar patterns of weather telemetry. Yet this one band refused, giving shape and cadence when none should exist. I checked another source online, a public feed collecting data from those same buoys. The anomaly wasn't archived there. My machine alone seemed to carry it. I thought maybe it was my rig failing old receiver, newer software patched together. I swapped a spare cable, tuned again. Still it breathed. I pulled the plug, ran off battery. The signal persisted. My notes grew frantic, ink smudging under sweat. I leaned back finally, the chair creaking, listening on loop. The breath pressed close, like someone leaning inches away, hidden but unwilling to stop. I remembered divers describing their oxygen regulators freezing, the hiss of each inhale turning enemy. The association latched onto me. I checked the clock. Past 3. The anomaly still hissed and fell, steady as lungs in sleep. I told myself it must be artifact. Layers blending from unrelated frequencies, the way an old tape sometimes bleeds through if stored badly. Yet my stomach disagreed. I felt watched, though no eyes could exist inside static. I kept speaking notes aloud into the handheld recorder. Location traced. Mid-Atlantic buoys. Time log entries precise. I marked every interval so later no one could accuse me of exaggeration. My voice, strained and dry, clashed with the steady rise and fall of the hiss behind it. The recorder caught us both in duet. Occasionally the rhythm stuttered, doubling tempo as though startled. Then it slowed again, slipping back to baseline. The patterns make no sense for weather data. Radio interference tends to spike, not breathe. I wrote the word impossible down 3 times, then crossed it out. An hour later, watching the spectrogram bloom again, I thought of bodies on X-rays. Not the flesh, just outlines, captured only because radiation chose to reveal what light could not. That was what my machine was giving me. Outlines made of noise. Glimpses carried not by intention, but by accident. Unless intention was there, just hidden under the carrier. The apartment around me shrank. Rain tapped once on the window, then stopped, almost a warning. The lamp flickered, and I glanced toward the outlet. Everything else stayed steady. Only the bulb shivered with the signal. I was sure of it. I searched older recordings. My own archives spread across drives. Nothing similar appeared. Only tonight. I checked NOAA logs, and while the band registered slight disturbance, there was no mention of rhythmic patterns. Bureaucracy had flattened it to anomaly recorded, cause unknown, review pending. I tried phoning the number listed on the document, but received only an after-hours line. So I sat. Alone, notebooks cluttering the desk, headphones marking my ears red, and in the center of it all, a faint hiss repeating. Sometimes it sounded like inhaling, sometimes like a long exhale. I tested myself, breathing along, then holding still. The static carried on in exact cycle, oblivious yet intimate. Doubts circled. My grief made me prone to hearing ghosts. Maybe my mind reached for breath, because I wanted to hear humanity where none existed. Still, the visualization argued against illusion. Machines don't empathize with mourning. Machines don't revise noise into lungs. Closer to dawn, my chest heavy, eyes burning, I made a decision. I would keep this tape separate, dated and marked, sealed for later analysis. My hand shook when I wrote Anomaly 1 on the sleeve. I told myself the name mattered. First entries always do. I ended the night pacing, restless, replaying fragments of what the half-speed tape offered. The room seemed to breathe with me, shadows swelling on the wall in time with the hiss. At times I wondered if I was falling asleep with eyes open. But the recording never blinked, never broke. Every breath stayed on iron loop, and then, with no build, the spectrogram flared. Every other pattern had been faint, washed in pale color. This bloom ignited deep red. The outline jagged, improbable, almost like a face hidden in scanning error. I froze, not artifice, not algorithmic trick. A face where no one should be, drawn in static smear. I stared until pain stung my eyes. I willed it to fade so rationality could crawl back. But the bloom pulsed, one impossible beat, and persisted. When I finally shut the machine, silence weighed heavier than any sound. My ears rang as though the breath still pressed against me. I sank into the couch, unable to stay near the desk. The tapes ran cool on the counter. I thought of deleting them. But I couldn't shake the sense that if I did, the signal would return anyway, only louder. More insistent. So I let it play out in my memory. Thin static, rhythmic fall and rise. Blooming lines bending toward forms they should not make. The entire night now tied to a single question I couldn't stop asking myself. Was this only a glitch born of wires and tired eyes? Or had I touched the edge of something old, waiting for someone to listen? The file arrived on a plain disk, tucked into a manila envelope, no return address. Only the black marker reminder of the foyer request I had almost forgotten. Months of bureaucratic silence, and here it was unheralded, unannounced. The disk looked cheap, easy to miss. My name scribbled only once in the corner, respondent. I slid it into the drive, half eager, half afraid. The screen filled with grainy footage. A diver in a bulky suit, the jagged timestamp marking 1997. The video carried no sound. I expected something, anything. The muffled rush of air systems, the slap of water against equipment casing. Nothing but the diver's heavy body lamp bending across dark water. For 12 minutes, the visual played in silent monotony. Strange. What shook me was the accompanying hydrophone file stored beside it. I plugged in my headphones, chose the highest fidelity I could manage. The first seconds felt like a mistake, an unsettling hum, droning low and wide. No voices, no regular sonar pings, just this layered humming tone. I thought maybe the file had corrupted. But as I sat still, the sound formed patterns beneath the noise. The layers were not random. They pulsed in intervals that climbed, paused, then fell again, like orchestrated chords inside a cathedral. The symmetry felt impossible underwater. Passive sonar scatters. This cohered. 12 minutes of rising and falling cycles, like the ocean itself was using lungs. I felt my stomach tighten. The rhythm came too close to something alive. The diver on screen swam forward into nothingness, light reaching only a meter or two. His movement felt detached from the sound I heard. Silent actions paired with this resonant drone pulled me into a disconnect. My mind kept waiting for the hum to connect with his gestures, but the gap remained eerie, deliberate. Minute 6, the drone sharpened. A faint overtone crept higher, carrying subtle warble. It reminded me of polyphonic chanting, voices layered inside echoes too deep to identify. I paused the playback, pulled the headphones off, rubbed at my ears. The hum seemed to linger even without the file running. I put them back on and continued despite the disquiet crawling my chest. The depth gauge on screen flickered. Numbers rolled steadily down until, all at once, they jumped, then cut. The overlay froze at 430 feet while the diver continued forward, oblivious, as though the measure itself had been censored. The music-like hum cracked open into sudden silence at the exact moment the digits vanished. Nothing after. The diver's lamp tilted upward, catching bubbles, then the video ended blank. The hydrophone flatlined. 12 minutes neatly closed. The implication landed sharp. The diver never surfaced, but the recording ended as though it had. The instrument cut out while documenting a return that may not have happened. The tape lied, or the tape carried what really occurred, that the sound ended him. I logged the observation, words clumsy under the weight pressing my chest. Rhythm builds unease to nausea, I scribbled. Depth drop not aligned with procedure. Recording ended before subject observed resurfacing. My notes read almost bureaucratic, but I felt rattled. I ran analysis, shoving the file through Spectrum software. The printout portrayed a strange symmetry, arcs of energy mapping into almost geometric shapes, like the teeth of combs stacked against each other. Too precise for natural collapse. Rolling water scatter should smear peaks, not yield such clean layering. I stared at the graph, watched as one wave repeated itself every 60 seconds like a clock ticking inside the sea. This was engineered, or perhaps emergent from some structure hidden below. The notion felt wrong. No one engineers the abyss. Unless the ocean did so by itself. The clock on my wall edged toward dawn. I had been replaying 12 minutes of hum for over an hour. My body told me to stop, to get air. I stood, opened the window. Cold early light blurred the edges of town. I breathed deep to separate myself from the memory of those layered tones. They followed anyway, resonating in my ribs. What pushed me deeper wasn't just oral disgust. It was the resonance inside the timeline. 1997. Naval dive. Disruptive static appearing then. My sister swallowed by the sea only months later. Separate events, but I couldn't deny the whisper of alignment. So I began cross-referencing. NOAA logs, maritime archives, even scanned newspaper briefs. Times when instruments failed, divers gone missing, sonar tests halted. I started a raw chart, overlapping dates against tides and storms. Patterns began sketching themselves. faint lines suggesting alignment across years. The deeper connection frightened me, but it sparked purpose too. Such vanishing points were never fully explained, always accidents, malfunctions, human error. Yet each bore the same shadow, loss followed by missing data. Like someone had drawn a curtain across both people and machines. That diver in the grainy video, his lamplight pointing upward toward the bubbles that may not have belonged to him. That mirrored too closely an emptiness I felt since my own loss. Staring, rewinding, replaying, I couldn't cast away the feeling that the tonality of that hum and my memories of her voice touched at the same edge. I sat back at the desk, dawn mist seeping through the window. The hum from the tape seemed to stretch over the quiet outside, binding time into one loop. With pen shaking, I sketched another chart on fresh paper. Diver, 1997, 12 minutes of layered chance, depth cut, silence. Sister, same year, absence without report. Same ocean basin. Same unresolved silence. The facts alone may not mean anything, but grief makes facts cling together, clutching. I told myself I would map until something real appeared. Until overlap itself proved more than longing, the memory of the hum stayed. Loose and dull in my ears, still vibrating behind the words I wrote. I set the headphones down, backed away from the desk, but any quiet moment stretched into the suggestion of repetition. The rhythm returned in the radiator, in the wind against the glass. I rubbed at my chest where the pulses had landed hardest, wondering if the sound belonged to tape anymore, or to me. I checked the disc one last time. The file structure registered normal. No corruption, no edits acknowledged. It might have been just another classified dive mishap, buried under bureaucracy, resurrected through stubborn paperwork. But the precision of that hum contradicted the simplicity of accident. As the sun lifted, pale against thin clouds, I weighed whether to seal the envelope again, or to keep the disc within reach. Keeping it meant binding myself closer, yet I already knew hiding it would solve nothing. Sounds so precise never vanish. They surface again, even after decades. So I placed the disc beside the earlier tape from last night, labeling both anomalies together. And I knew the hunt had only begun, because if these sounds connected, then so did the missing. And what the ocean has hidden, it has hidden carefully. The letter came folded twice and thick enough to suggest weight, though its contents proved thin. The return address bore the NOAA crest in faint blue, the paper glossy and real, not the flimsy laser prints I had come to expect. I held it by the edges, as though fingerprints might change what it wanted to say. The text inside was short, businesslike, and worse, deliberately evasive. Research expeditions pending classification, it wrote. Operational reviews ongoing. Phrases circled around meaning without touching it. My questions about anomalous recordings found their answers redirected into a bureaucratic cul-de-sac. Language trained to stay upright while stiffening against intrusion. It told me less than silence, because silence is neutral. This was crafted denial. I spread the letter flat across the desk and marked lines with a pen. Certain phrases stood out, uncanny in their familiarity. I searched my archive, stacked old bulletins against this new page. I found it at last. A 1973 memo titled simply Oceanographic Reevaluation. The sentences matched almost exactly, word for word. Paragraph structure identical, commas perfectly placed. They had reused the same text, decades later, as though the language itself served as a wall, buried in the bottom corner in faint gray ink, a tracking code. At first glance it looked like a routine filing number, but most office codes run short. This string extended far too long, characters waited in unfamiliar sequence. I jotted it into my log, circled it twice. My instinct whispered this line pointed past the open archive, into the shelves kept locked. I paced the small room, paper trembling whenever my grip loosened. My breath wasn't steady. I wanted hard acknowledgement. Instead, I had the echo of older evasions dressed up as official reply. My voice recorder clicked on as I muttered notes aloud. The tone felt tired, but I documented everything: dates, sources, suspicion of template recycling. Another wall, but walls leave shadows when built hastily. By late evening, the letter still lay across the desk, as though claiming territory. I set up to record a longer narration for the day's findings. Microphone adjusted, headphones in place, the apartment falling otherwise quiet. The only sound was the clock and the rasp of my throat. I spoke carefully, tracing the chain from tonight's mail back through years of duplications. I leaned into the cadence, half reading, half confessing. When I played the tape back, a faint hiss surfaced. At first I thought it was background noise, the air vents sneaking into the track. But the hiss saturated only the pauses. My words cut clean, then silence filled with low static that dimmed when I resumed speaking. The tape seemed to breathe opposite me. I tried again, this time leaving deliberate spaces between sentences. The hiss widened, longer now, almost sliding. I isolated the noise on screen, zooming into waveforms. Most hiss appears ragged, thick with spikes. This one ran tighter, smoother, as though carrying an intention I couldn't name. I turned the volume low and listened again. The sliding formed contour, nearly a vowel, almost a shaping mouth where nothing should be. My stomach turned. I reminded myself, recordings glitch. Electromagnetic interference travels from neighbors' appliances and settles into cheap wires. That's rational. But in every take, the hiss responded only to my silence. The moment I filled air with words, the anomaly dropped away. When I stopped, it seeped back in, greedy. I stared at the NOAA emblem glowing faintly under the lamp. Paper still covered in impersonal words. Yet behind those words, something else stirred, perhaps unnoticed even by the ones who wrote them. Perhaps not. Perhaps the same silence they maintained was the silence now reaching into my room. I whispered into the microphone once more. My own fear clung close in my chest. If you hear me, what do you want? Foolish to speak aloud, irrational. Yet afterward, the hiss softened, lowering like a held breath exhaled slowly. Recorded, archived. I replayed it several times, each time wondering if I had asked a question. Only silent machines should catch. Night stretched toward 2:00 a.m. I left the headphones hanging off the knob but couldn't tune out the memory of that sliding hiss. Every shadow in the corners carried faint sound, like waves heard through walls. I checked once, twice, convinced someone could stand outside the apartment. There was no one. Only the echo in my head of noise trying to bend language. The official reply. All those polished words refused to name anything real. Yet in returning a template, they had named something to spite themselves. A record of fear republished decade over decade. I thought of the diver, vanishing mid-breath. I thought of my sister swallowed with no trace. Institutions hold silence not because answers lack, but because the shape of the answers threatens more than loss itself. I penned one last line in the notebook, dated and clear. Request made, answer denied. Silence documented, silence speaking back. I kept the page dry under my palm, not wanting it to smudge. The microphone remained plugged in. I tried to sleep, but each time my eyelids lowered, I imagined the hiss creeping back into the room, recording me even in stillness. Not responding this time, not breathing with me, but preparing. And as dawn tried weakly to rise, I lay awake and thought, maybe in sending questions across official lines, I hadn't simply disturbed bureaucracy. Maybe I had opened something older that resists closure. And the hiss, bending toward voice, promised it would not stop now. The harbor at night carried its own kind of silence. Not empty, the creak of ropes, the soft fender bump of moored boats, the occasional slap of water against pilings. But it was a silence that breathed, a silence that carried weight. I met the technician by the service shed, a man known mostly for fixing radios for commercial trawlers. He smoked through most of our exchange, and though he didn't ask many questions, his raised eyebrow suggested he knew I wasn't here for routine checks. Still, when I asked for hydrophones, slate reels, a portable meter, he slid the cases forward without argument. Harbor gear. Tools meant to verify depth, measure silt, or trace errant prop vibrations. Tools I pretended would help track interference. I thanked him, carried the cases out alone to the end of a rotting pier. The wood sagged under my boots. I worked by headlamp, nervous hands clumsy on latches. Eventually I had the rig assembled. Hydrophone line rolled off a reel. Simple meter set for surface checks. Recorder running on tape. A setup any harbor inspector would find boring. I expected the same. The water below looked black, the faint harbor lights breaking into uneasy ripples. I lowered the hydrophone. The long line unspooled hand over hand, and for minutes nothing but empty bubbling filled the headphones. My jaw ached from clenching. Part of me wanted failure. Failure would mean control. Then the reel jerked. A short tug, as though something caught the line 30 feet below. Reflex pulled the headphones tighter against my skull. The bubbles broke, replaced by sound harder, stranger. Knocking, measured, deliberate. Not the chaotic rock on rock or hull on pot patterns I had often logged. This was cadenced. Knocks repeating with the tempo of someone rapping from inside a sealed space dot. My pulse climbed in pace with the sound. I checked the line. It swayed only slightly, though the reel vibrated against my palm. I steadied it, pressed all my weight against the boardwalk planks to convince myself I wasn't trembling. The knocking pressed on, rhythmic, patient. 1 second between each beat. Knock, knock. I whispered observations into the recorder. Anomalies consistent. Short repeats, minimal drift. My voice sounded smaller than I wanted. The headphones pressed hot, my ears struggling to map what they heard. The cadence turned uncanny. Not random geology. I knew from reading how ice can fracture underwater, carrying knocks like drums. But this rhythm was compressed into something too clean. Compressed harmonics stacked as if composed. For reassurance, I played back a slice immediately. The tape carried same knocks, identical spacing. Any second play should reveal imperfections, yet this stayed perfect. I layered one sample against another. Every notch aligned, exact match, no natural scatter. I leaned out over the railing to look down at the water. Rippled reflections stared back. The harbor lights, the jitter of my own headlamp tracing across black. Yet in those reflections my face shifted oddly, distorted not just by water movement, but in sync with the knocking. Each rap on tape corresponded to a slight warp, as though my own features pulsed wider, then shrank. At the fifth beat, the shift lengthened enough to blur my mouth into absence. I jerked upright, looked skyward instead. The tape rolled on. My chest stung with cold air. I scrawled notes fast, pen bleeding ink where sweat dampened the paper. Every instinct said pull the line in, end this now. But instead I let the hydrophone hang, listening. The more I endured, the more the pattern shifted. Sometimes it doubled tempo, rattling like someone desperate against glass. Then it steadied again, returning to that one-beat rhythm. The change felt aware rather than accidental. Testing, probing. My mind filled with old imagery of survivors pounding from beneath frozen lakes, their fists muffled by inches of ice. I'd never witnessed it myself, but the story seeped into this moment, painting each knock as a warning. I tried to separate coincidence from proof. Each sound became a demand to listen deeper, to accept that geology doesn't plead. The surface below gleamed faint. I forced myself to look again. My reflection reappeared, warped still, though calmer now. The distortion made my head lengthen slightly, a funhouse stretch mirrored by dark water. I convinced myself it was only wave interference. Then came another knock. The reflection's mouth opened wider than mine, bending through ripple in time with the sound. I couldn't breathe for several beats. I forced myself to anchor in routine. Log every detail. Time, cadence, gear integrity. I spoke all of it into the microphone, though my voice cracked at the edges. The tape will show nerves, but also truth. At last I reeled the hydrophone back. The line felt tangibly heavier than when it went down. I kept expecting drag, resistance, proof of some shape clinging beneath unseen. Yet when the black sphere surfaced, it was clean, dripping only brine, knocking now stilled. The relief almost buckled my knees. I packed the equipment fast, fumbling clasps, snapping reels into cases. Even as I sealed them, my head still rang from knocks. The listener in me lingered, hearing beats long after silence had returned. I slammed the van's door shut against the echo, drove home with the cases seated heavy beside me. Inside the apartment, I replayed stretches of tape. Each knock sounded harder in the narrow hall light than on the pier itself. Louder, too close for comfort. When looping the sequences backward, harmonics aligned into faint chords, ghost architecture, nearly tonal. I stopped myself before I could imagine words congealing inside them. My reflection replayed just as vividly. The warped face in the harbor surface haunted me more than any tape could. Documentation doesn't protect against memory. I knew if I pretended it was coincidence, I would only give the anomaly more permission. So I wrote it clearly. Final line in the log for that night: do not dismiss again. Gear caught cadence unexplainable by geology. Reflection responded in rhythm. Anomaly maintains persistence beyond ears. I shut the notebook, unplugged the recorder, but silence still pulsed with phantom beats. Each pause invited another knock echoing in my chest. Sleep never came. I lay in the dark, eyes closed tight, waiting for the sound to seep through walls again. My last thought before dawn was surrender. The ocean wanted me to note it, and I had. And nothing in me dared call it accident ever again. I started the filtering late, long after the harbor session ended. My desk was cluttered with notebooks, empty mugs, the salt-smelling hydrophone tape coiled beside the machinery like something freshly pulled up from the sea itself. The knocks from the pier had been replaying in my head for days, so I decided to run a deeper spectral analysis. Strip noise, highlight peaks, chase patterns. Anything to prove it. Had been random geology, misheard rhythm. The screen bloomed with color bands as the algorithm parsed the recording. Peaks rose where the knocks had sounded strongest, each beat leaving a ridge in the data. At first it looked technical, clean lines across a grid. But when I dragged the filters finer, the ridges twisted. They didn't taper like ordinary noise. They bunched, shaped into forms my eye could not help but parse as phonetic. I slowed playback until the knocks stretched like vowels. My gut iced over. Consonants built unbidden inside the rise and fall, uneven but unmistakable. Not words yet, but closer, as though the ocean's rhythm concealed syllables too large to hear in real time. I scribbled notes fast, heart thudding. Cadence approximating human articulation. Potential pareidolia. Need verification. The hairs on my arms rose when I looped a 15-second segment, filtered just above human vocal range. 3 syllables emerged, dragged out across beats. My name hovered in my chest, but what my ears caught was worse. It was hers. My sister's, spoken in static and water, half vowels smudged but undeniable. I froze, replayed again. And again. The knocks drew her name, the same pattern each time. Each loop opening the wound further, I pulled metadata. My eyes burned when I traced the timestamp. The digit string mirrored the day she disappeared, years ago. Down to the hour. It was there like a scar in code. Too precise for chance. I tore that number into my notebook, hand shaking, trying not to believe but unable to dismiss. I called the broadcast engineer, the only one I could trust even half with something like this. He listened politely, playback low through his own monitors. After a time, he sighed, calm but guarded. His verdict: compression artifacts. He explained how harmonics fold into bizarre shapes when frequencies snap against each other. Language like fragments can emerge. Trick of perception. Chance. Storage glitch. I wanted to nod, to let rationality anchor me. But his phrases sounded like the letter's evasions, polished and cold. Because between his explanation and my own body, I knew there was intent. Machines don't repeat her name like that. Machines don't know the date, I argued softly. He cautioned me to leave it, to step away from tapes for the night. I promised, though I knew I wouldn't. Alone again, dawn creeping pale under the blinds, I pressed the headphones hard against my ears until they hurt. Her name surfaced over and over, woven from knocks and static. Each time it met me somewhere between grief and recognition. The cruelest part wasn't the reminder of her absence. It was that the sound carried weight like presence. As if she endured not in memory, but in some archive adjacent to mine. Broadcasting faintly across lines I should never have opened. Ended the night staring at the waveform, still moving across the screen. Knowing the difference between coincidence and communication may never be proven. And still suspecting, in my deepest hurt, that this voice hadn't risen from below water at all, but from a place next to grief itself, waiting for me to listen long enough to hear my sister's name again. The documents covered the desk until I could barely see the wood beneath them. NOAA storm reports on thin thermal paper, Navy seismic logs stapled crooked, public radio archives printed from poor scans. I aligned them by date first, stacking years until pages leaned like tired roofs. Most nights these files give only static facts. But patterns start not in the bold headings, but in the quiet repetition of anomalies listed in margins and appendices. I searched for collisions. Nights when surface weather swelled into storms at the same time, the seafloor shook hundreds of miles away. At first, coincidences seemed sparse. A storm in late spring, a quake deep in the trench half a world apart. But as I set them side by side, months collapsed into one another, and alignments bloomed. Seismograph peaks shared dates with lost radio feeds. Thunder echoing the same nights that hydrophones dropped to chaos. I drew a line through each overlap with a black pen. Soon the paper web looked less like accident and more like fracture lines across glass. I felt my chest tighten, as though bracing for something heavy to fall. Mid-Atlantic storms sensed most often. Each time lightning spiked above, instruments deep below went blind. I phoned the engineer, voice raw from hours of silence. He listened as I laid out the findings, no patience in my delivery. His pause lasted long enough to chill me. When two bands converge, he said slowly, they can fold into each other. Happens with interference every day. But what you describe isn't usual drift. It's mirror. One above, one below. I asked him what mirror meant in practice. He exhaled hard, static from his line crawling into my ear. Projection, he muttered. Voices where no one is. Instruments that bend. You get two signals crossing thresholds they weren't built to carry. Voices projected. The word refused to loosen. It suggested not simply interference, but transmission across mediums never meant to overlap. The ocean becoming an antenna of the storm doubling what lurked beneath. I combed back through the logs with his warning in mind. Whenever thunder peaked hard enough to splinter upper atmosphere bands, hydrophones in the basin below registered distortions. Not random, not sloppy scatter, but repeated resonance. Sky speaking with trench through invisible wires. By midnight, I sat hunched over the mixing deck, chasing proof for myself. I layered open-source storm sound onto the old hydrophone tape. On its own, thunder is ragged and raw. Buried into that trench recording, though, something sharper emerged. The waveforms interlocked like teeth. I rolled the fader up. The combination punched through my chest like a second heartbeat. It hit so hard I gasped. The pulsing tempo merged wave, wind, and deep. Lightning rattled across the headphones, followed by the low moan of the trench. They collided clean at one repeating frequency. Instead of distortion, it felt deliberate, one rhythm born from two sources miles apart. The pulses thickened. I leaned closer until the deck's lights painted my knuckles red. Each beat linked to the next with surgical precision. My throat pulsed against the headphones as though sinking involuntarily. I gripped the desk to stop myself from falling forward. The engineer had said interference can bend. This wasn't bending. This was folding space. The rhythm filled every gap between my breaths. I whispered notes into the mic but struggled to hear my own voice over the thrum. My words seemed to slide into the rhythm, clipped shorter, carried away. I stared at the meters trembling against their pins. Lightning and trench didn't just meet, they fused into something neither alone contained. The storm outside my window rattled faint glass just slightly out of phase with what I heard in my ears. Inside and outside pressed tight. The rational line suggested accident. Freak overlaps, rare but natural. Yet the volume built like intent, holding steady as if timed. Each pulse pressed deeper, promising continuation beyond mechanical chance. I couldn't think of it only as sound anymore. I wrote quickly in the margins of my notes. If signals mirror, they may not just travel. They may cross. The symbols underlined themselves as though my hand no longer free. The deck hissed. Meters barged into red. Thunder swallowed low hum until both sang in lockstep. Each second widened my unease. Widened also something else. The possibility that in chasing radio noise, I had touched resonance not bounded by air or sea. When the last spike dropped sudden into silence, I was left panting at the desk, shaking wrists stiff above the board. Silence saturated the room too heavily, as though it waited for my next breath before resuming cycle. I didn't dare replay, but the truth nested already. I had heard it. Frequencies that should never meet had folded into each other, hammering a rhythm stronger than anything alone. It didn't sound like the end of noise. It sounded like the beginning of threshold. The storm arrived sharp, slanting wind against the glass, rain beating in quick bursts like fists on the walls. Thunder rolled in uneasy intervals. I had the recorder running anyway, powered by its backup battery. Habit kept it rolling through everything, even when I thought there would be nothing useful to capture. The lights flickered once, then failed entirely. The lamp died, the desk screen darkened. Apartment drowned in heaviness, only rain and its methodical hammering remaining. Odd that silence can feel loud when power dies. The space seemed to contract, walls pulled closer, only shapes visible through faint lightning spills. I stayed still in the chair, refusing to move for candles. The blackness pressed closer, forcing me to rely on sound alone. The recorder's tiny red diode blinked weak in the dark. I could at least feel its presence, one small reminder something still witnessed the night. Each drop on the window seemed too loud. I leaned forward, ear near the pane, heartbeat running quick beneath the thunder. The rain fell in strange clusters, short hard taps followed by longer pauses. At first I thought I was only projecting, but the more I listened, the more those patterns pushed into rhythm. Not random scatter. I held breath until lungs ached. The knocks of rain repeated short, short, long. Then another pause. Short, long, short. Morse flashed in my head, though I hadn't practiced code since childhood puzzles. The idea rusted but returned anyway. Thunder punctuated the sequence. My hand found a pen in the darkness, shaky lines scrawling dots and dashes across whatever notebook page I could touch. Drops built fragments. My pulse beat against my skull, in synchrony with the coded rhythm I half imagined, half heard. The blackout remained. Nothing hummed anymore. Even the refrigerator downstream fell dead quiet. Only water and sky owned the world. When morning returned weak current to the building, I played back the recorder immediately. Headphones pressed my ears raw. The track confirmed it was not just imagination. The rain had struck rhythmic. Drops sharpened into binary marks, intervals too neat for weather coincidence. I slowed the recording, jotting strokes with obsessive precision. Some sequences collapsed like static when translated nonsense, corrupted phrases. But one fragment refused to dissolve. The symbols spelled 4 letters with chilling clarity. I whispered it aloud, lips dry, beneath. The word hung inside the dark room, heavier than thunder. I phoned the engineer again, voice shaking though I tried to steady it. He listened without interruption, only leaning into static line clicks like a doctor reading heartbeat scans. Finally, he replied with carefully chosen words. Battery systems during storms sometimes throw harmonics. Stray voltages fold clean coincidences into Morse timing. It can mimic code. I nodded though he couldn't see, face pressed into my hand. His explanation carried weight, but not enough to balance what I had heard. Chance could arrange fragments, but chance doesn't arrange cadence to mirror my own speaking rhythm. I told him that, half whispered, admitting how the pulses aligned strangely with my own breath patterns. He hushed, then chose silence over argument. The connection cut soon after. Night still lingered behind my eyes as I sat replaying the file. Rain carried by thunderstorm had transcribed something, either from my own voice or from whatever lurked outside. The word repeated, beneath. Every time it returned, it shivered deeper through my spine. The blackout added its own terror. How could rules fail so easily? Power gone, storm commanding voice, recording channeling phrases I could not stop once heard. My mind twisted options. Perhaps storms drag radio patterns down, lightning imprinting fragments of my memory into rain as transcription. Or perhaps rain itself doubled as code messenger, slapping glass into hydrogen language older than people. The window reflected my face when next lightning broke across the sky. I stared at that pale expression, distorted in melted lines of water running down the glass. The reflection looked strained, fragmented into Morse itself. My eyes seemed absent between beads. Dots spread like hollow sockets. I turned away but kept listening. Each replay confirmed the word again. Beneath. Always beneath. I wondered if the storm had read me, scraped my cadence, stolen thought from silence, and returned it as code. Or if something else pressed voice into water while I sat there, powerless in the extinguished room. Either explanation made solitude heavier. The blackout felt like a rehearsal for ongoing absence. Just me, blinking diode. Storm handwriting across plaster and glass. When morning light streamed dim through the blinds, I found myself slumped at the desk, pen lines covering the page. Dots and dashes scribbled in clumsy sets marked my hand. Some had meaning, some only gibberish, but one in particular repeated the same 7 letters until the paper tore thin. I set the recorder aside finally, but my ears refused silence. Every patter of rain carried the ghost of code. Every drip reminded me storms could talk if combined with circuits and desperation. And maybe they had listened in return. I didn't know which frightened me more, that the storm voiced thoughts belonging only to me, or that the word never belonged to me at all. Beneath. Always beneath. The code looked harmless at first. A row of digits tucked in the footer of the NOA letter, gray and nearly faded like a filing afterthought. But something about its excess length drew me. Too many figures, too neat in their repetition. I followed the sequence through public catalogs, each door closing in seconds. Firewalled, archived, restricted. But one cross-reference slipped. A mismatch in the digital index pointed offline, to a storage facility in Virginia. The description read, Miscellaneous Meteorological Media, 1961,970. I drove 6 hours with only black coffee and a rest stop sandwich. The unit was unremarkable. a cinder block structure clinging against wet fields, air sodden with pine. The clerk barely looked up when I slid paper across the counter. He stamped approval and pointed to a rusting roll-up door. Inside hung the smell of dust, tape, glue, and mildew. Stacks of reels sagged against bent shelves. Each was labeled with white stickers, numbers fading brown. My flashlight beam landed on one shelf, misaligned by a clerk's lazy hand. There, shoved between directories of wind data, were a set of 6 reels stamped marine anomalies. 1968. The handwriting looked hurried. Almost frantic. I carried one reel to the small listening station in the corner and whispered a date into my recorder before loading it. The machine groaned at first, belt catching after long sleep. Finally the tape caught rhythm, unspooling into headphones heavy and stale over my ears. The first minute sounded like weather, bulletins, clipped voices listing barometric pressures, wind speeds across Chesapeake. Old broadcasts recycled for archiving. But layered faint behind them ran static, not random but rising in lung-like expansions. 17 minutes struck like a hammer. The weatherman paused mid-sentence, clipped by a frequency burst. Through static, another voice edged into range, female, shaky, uneven. She didn't read. She repeated, again and again, 2 words, surface closed. Her tone cracked across the tape, frightened. I clawed at the notebook, writing fast in the dim. Surface closed repeated. Female voice not in script. Age distortion apparent. Thunder outside the storage unit crackled as though it knew. I pressed replay, isolating the voice with filters until her speech cut nearly clean. The accent struck me first, a stretched vowel particular to our family's region. Then the cadence, the exact tilt of emphasis I remembered my sister using when nervous. I stopped cold. This reel claimed 1968. She was born 20 years later. My throat seized. I dialed the engineer, voice stumbling as I described what played in my ears. He cursed softly, then hardened. Impossible, he said flat. Archiving errors happen. Tapes mix. Old material bleeds. Your brain's matching patterns it wants to hear. But denial doesn't blunt recognition. I carried a tiny box of family cassettes with me whenever I traveled. Tucked one into the station, rewound to a long-forgotten birthday tape. Her laughter tumbled across aging plastic, breathy and cracking as it had when she sang off-key. Then I played the reel again. The closeness hollowed me. The vowels. The uneven tremor when she said simple words with weight. Nearly identical. Sweat slid down my temple. I muttered notes into the recorder, though my voice shook badly now. Every replay cut deeper. Had machines preserved her before she existed? Or had the archive folded time into a confused loop, letting voices drop out where they never belonged? I checked the room. Damp cartons rose like faceless bodies in corners. The exit door leaned shut too heavy. I pushed the headphones back tight, needing to know how the fragment ended. Her voice cut again, higher this time. The hiss bled sharp until it overpowered. Meters on the console spiked hard. Needles bent red, slamming against stoppers even though gain levels remained low. Headphones sang with a roar that wasn't just white noise. It was shrill, almost metallic. Shapes of feedback but cleaner, as though deliberate. I shrank from the machine yet couldn't stop it. My pen line staggered across paper, spike sustained, hiss like pressure vessel release, reading top scale. The sound collapsed all at once. Nothing left on tape. Just the reel turning emptily around its spindle, whispering spool against spool. I left it running anyway, staring at blank meters, certain something hidden might arrive. Minutes dragged. The unit lights hummed. The tape rolled without gift. Still I refused to stop it. I couldn't. Silence had leaned into me heavier than sound. In that emptiness I swore I still heard her last syllables, looped like a phantom fluctuation, telling me again what could not be said anywhere else. Surface closed. When at last I pulled the reel free, my palms were slick. Plastic bent under my grip. I stuffed the tape into the case and slammed it shut, leaving the machine whining. On the long drive home, headlights sucked the road forward without mercy. No radio, no relief. I carried the reel on the passenger seat in its cracked shell. Too near, too heavy. I did not dare glance at it. I reached my desk just before dawn. The lamp flared against paper where my notes sprawled messy, letters cutting near unreadable by trembling hand. Yet every page showed the same entry, scratched deeper and deeper as though etching stone. Surface closed. The file may have been misfiled. The voice may have been bleed. Archive error. Maybe. But error does not sway meters red. Error does not mimic a sister lost 2 decades later, calling across tape made long before she lived. I left the reels out on the desk, staring at their black shells. I didn't even rewind. Each sat waiting, and I wondered if silence between them might still carry her voice. For hours I let them breathe the heavy dark dot, and sometimes, when the building sighed, hiss returned faint like a coat of salt on the walls. Crawling back into the room, even as no spool turned, I kept writing until sunlight reached the blinds. Notes dissolving into scribbles. My handwriting breaking into downward strokes, unsteady. My final entry for the night was a question not meant to be answered. What archive carries voices before their time? And who decides when the surface closes for good? The engineer agreed to meet me in the sound booth, though reluctance bled through every word. He carried half the gear himself: compressors, patches, shielding tape. His face looked older in the flat fluorescent light, worry lines worn deep. "We'll test, not prove," he warned. I nodded, though between us, proving was all I wanted. The booth swallowed sound as soon as the door shut. Walls padded in dull gray foam. The kind of room meant for clarity, not mystery. Yet the mystery filled it anyway. I set the reels and notes in careful lines across the table, each tape labeled with anxious scrawl. The storm codes, the trench knocks, the anomalous hiss, all braided into one archive that had begun to envelop me. Hold. We linked the line out to his console, channeling signals through equalizers sharp enough to catch breath between static bands. Headphones tight, meters glowing faint. The reel clicked alive. Most of the track was silent tape crackle. Slowly, resonance began to bloom. The wave peaked low, a sub-bass moan rising without melody. At first it reminded me of subway tunnels or a slow train grinding distant steel. But through amplification, new sounds stratified. Overtones caught like teeth locking. Harmonics stacked clearer than before, snapping together so exact they formed chords. The engineer hunched, dialing controls with slight tremor. "Too precise for interference," he muttered. "Not praise, not belief. More warning." He adjusted dampers, but still the resonance pushed cleaner, fuller. Each sweep pressed my chest as though the sound itself carried weight into the cage of my ribs. I whispered into my recorder, describing the sensation. Pressure like blunt hands pressing sternum inward. The resonance merged with heartbeat, slower at times, then overtaking me until nerve endings throbbed in stomach and throat. My voice thinned against it. We logged minutes meticulously. Waveform captured symmetrical arcs every 27 seconds. "Loop," he said, shaking his head. "Not possible this clean from layered sources." The resonance thickened until my hearing dulled. It wasn't just volume. It was invasion. Air inside the booth shifted, heavy with low vibration, pulling breath shallow. The engineer tapped his chest, pale expression betraying he felt it too. Then at peak, the booth microphone caught something else. We didn't hear it live, but on playback, clear as intrusion, an echo entered. Not my voice, not his. Half a sentence, then fragmented replay of itself. "Below." Low bail. Before it folded into hiss, we stilled, leaning toward the screen as if closeness could decode. Replayed again. Faint, self-repeating like a skipping record. Not quite word, not just accident. The engineer swore under breath, rubbing hard at his temples. Voltage foldover confabulation, he offered, too fast. I shook my head. My own body refused dismissal. The echo's cadence felt human but bent, stuck halfway through some corridor of translation. I logged. Artifact recorded at 4:57. Booth conditions stable. 2 witnesses. Source unidentified. We tried again with shielding engaged, copper mesh draped heavy around components. Still, when resonance peaked again, the echo returned. This time only breath fragments, syllables curling onto themselves without progress. Minutes dragged long. Sweat ran beneath my headphones, palms slick against the table edge. My pen cut grooves into the notebook paper, where I wrote the same note thrice. Someone else in channel dot, then without cue. Every meter jumped full red. Not a brief spike, but a pinned surge holding constant. For a full minute, longer than any system error should sustain. The panels quivered with strain, lights washing crimson across both our faces, breath clipped in my chest. I tried shouting over the noise, but my words bent too, blurred in headphones like fabric torn mid-sentence. We sat rigid inside resonance amplified to breaking point, until at last the surge collapsed sudden. Nothing remained but hiss and the silent spin of reels. My arms suffered pins and needles where circulation had bottled. The engineer gasped, pulled headset free like it had bitten him. Eyes wide, shaking his head, he muttered that it should have tripped breakers. But equipment remained alive, functioning, as if sound had chosen electricity instead of overwhelming it. I closed my eyes, hearing the phantom syllables even now. Words nearly born but forced premature, expelled into loops that begged for release. We stopped the test soon after, neither willing to risk another resonance climb. The engineer gathered wires in furious silence, his hands stiff with fear he couldn't voice. I lingered after he fled, booth door still half open, machine idling. I replayed the capture once more alone. The phantom half-sentence cut through me anew, below low. Low bail. Circling, I stared into the foam walls that silenced the real world, realizing the silence no longer belonged to me. Each session opened the channel wider. And channels once open, rarely close. I spread the datasets across every flat surface I had. Hydrophone logs from 3 separate arrays, borrowed at cost. Each array anchored at mid-depth zones half a world apart, stations that rarely mattered to ordinary research. Their feeds usually captured whale song, subroutines of pressure checks, the steady lungs of the ocean. Yet on the same storm-torn night when more syllables drummed against my window pane, all 3 arrays recorded identical bursts. I read them line by line, frequency by frequency. Tiny jolts of energy, irregular yet aligned in timing. Alone, each set looked like ordinary tremor static. But together, they formed something else entirely. I printed the events side by side. 12 bursts from each station within seconds of each other. I layered their shapes across software, stacking colors. Gradually the alignment stopped resembling noise. The bursts slotted together like bones in a skeleton, forming a structure greater than their parts. The waveform coalesced into bands that curved, arched, repeated. My heart knocked as I realized it wasn't language at all. It was imagery. Like a sonogram, the layered frequencies suggested outlines, 3-dimensional when folded in sequence. Shapes bloomed from sound data, rectangular voids deep within trench shadow, vaults arched by surrounding resonance. I pressed closer to the screen, pulse tangling my breath. Doors. That's what the outlines looked like. Not rock fissures, but doors set beneath crushing pressure, captured through nothing but pulses in water. My fingers sweated against the desk edge, leaves of notes drooping with damp. I flipped through diagrams, trying to tell myself it was algorithmic pareidolia, just like the engineer had said about the voice syllables. but architectural consistency locked against my denial. Angles repeated across bands, widths exact, duplication impossible from chance. I phoned the engineer, voice strained. I spoke too quick, describing outlines, vault silhouettes built out of rhythm. His paws stretched cold across the line. At last he muttered, "Then stop." I pressed him, demanded explanation, demanded why the arrays would capture such bursts if nothing deliberate pushed them. Artifacts, he argued. Machine overlap. Algorithms like yours chase ghosts. But the depth of his fear cracked through tone. He refused even to see the images, refused download. "It's too far outside," he said flatly. "If those patterns are as you describe, then you're not looking at accidents. You're trespassing. I won't go further." Then he hung up. The line cut like a slammed door. I was left alone with the transmission. A raw schematic of abyssal place, slotted into lines of code only listening machines could hear. Dawn had started grazing the blinds. I hadn't moved from the chair all night. The outlines glowed pale against the monitor. They compelled and repulsed in equal measure. I listened again. Headphones clamped. Now each burst pulled upward in pitch. Where before the noise had been blunt, almost geological, now it slid sharp, like steel wrung by mallet. The rising tone seemed more than mere sequence. It resembled signal escalation. A call climbing stairs of frequency. I closed my eyes. The vault forms grew behind lids, carved from lightless rock. The signal didn't just describe them. It beckoned. My body tensed with the recognition that these weren't passive images. They were instructions. Just as Morse and Rain had written words, this sequence now shaped invitation. Or else command. The bursts repeated until my ears bruised with ringing. Still I let them play. Because beneath fear resided compulsion, the kind grief never relinquishes. Each sound promised that doors existed where humans had no right to imagine them. And each rising note asked without language, "Enter." The coastal station looked deserted, though it never officially closed. Salt climbed the walls, paint stripped by seasons of brine, windows rattling with every ripple of offshore wind. Inside, the console still hummed with low power. I settled among rows of receivers and handheld monitors, dragging notebooks onto the table until the place resembled a bunker of paper. For hours, nothing shifted. Frequencies traced across the dials smooth and patient, aligned into steady lines. Maritime bands muttered ship manifests. FM spun out late-night music limp and unthreatening. Sputtered distance chatter from states away. Each spectrum bled into the next with dull predictability. I logged them anyway, each hour marked, stability confirmed. The night dragged. Around 2 in the morning the air chilled, the kind of drop you feel before a storm breaks. The sea outside groaned deeper. I leaned closer to one receiver, ears adjusting to whisper crackle. Still normal. Still calm. Then, without cue, the bands collapsed. Every channel at once. TV carriers, AM, FM, maritime static. They didn't fade like storm surge. They shattered together, erupting into noise that bit under my ribs. The silence of order gone, replaced by chaos so loud it smothered. Meters screened red, spiking erratic with no rhythm at all. Waveforms tangled into impossible shapes, jagged knots stretching unreal. I clutched headphones as though they could keep me anchored. 2 minutes, no longer, but it felt stretched beyond count. Through the roar, one strand cut clear. A single frequency pierced through like a wire through fabric. It trilled sharp enough to make my teeth ache, then steadied, carving phrase out of din. I froze. Because it didn't approximate a word. It filled syllables, purposeful and exact. It called my name, not close to, not mistaken. My name, clearer than any interference should allow. The syllables drawn rough but true, forming from static into voice, Each segment lined with the cadence shaped around me alone. My hands shook on the console. My chest swelled hollow. I couldn't decide whether to believe, but the room gave no doubt. The noise receded right after. Meters dropped back into calm ranges. Waves outside slipped back to steady rhythm. Maritime bands resumed with bored transmissions. AM returned with dull hiss of faraway preachers. FM eased soft songs. All across the air, balance returned. The collapse had ended, but the reminder of those syllables hung tense behind my eardrums. I wrote frantic in the log. Collapse across spectrum. Duration noted. Clear frequency pierced. Speech captured, name spoken. Must confirm playback later, yet my pen slowed midway. Because the question altered. It no longer felt like I was tracking. The phrasing gripped me with suspicion. Maybe now something tracked back. I flipped channels, desperate for repeat, but every line carried ordinary life. Yet a residue clung. A film in the air, like static lodged between lungs. I sat in heavy silence, machines alive once more. For a moment, just before dawn, every station logged sudden flat quiet. 2 full seconds of dead air. Then programming resumed. Like something had flexed, reset itself, and moved beyond. I collapsed back in the chair. Eyelids heavy, yet no rest in them. Because hearing my own name out of cracked spectrum meant this reached personal surface now. Evidence had stopped being anomaly and started being address. The page before me filled with raw scrawl. Who listens back? The diver paced the dot before agreeing. Wetsuit half unzipped. Body taut with hesitation. He had listened to fragments of my recordings, though he claimed disbelief. Still, curiosity convinced him, padded by the promise of payment and equipment I would provide. He warned flat that dives in this region felt wrong to him. Currents strange, instruments twitching without obvious cause. I assured him we would keep it shallow by professional measure, no more than 600 meters. A test only. Words reassured neither of us. The vessel drifted steady over the trench mouth. Sky flat gray, water heavy as plate. We assembled hydrophones on long spools, cables humming as they fed overboard. I logged markers aloud for record. At 100 meters normal. At 200 meters normal. Past 300, faint warble. The sea already pressed cold on my nerves. At 500 meters, clarity shattered. The signal bent violent, distortion chewing raw through headphones. But cutting through it for a handful of seconds came a tone so pure my gut recoiled. It struck round and metallic, like steel snapped under ocean weight. Loud enough my eardrums rang, even though attenuation should have softened it. Then silence. Only bubbles and rustle of cable running slack. The diver's voice surfaced sharp, gasping over radio. He aborted, muscles clenched. His words rushed, pressure shifts inside chest, wrong, crushing, not natural. Not external weight, but internal squeeze, as if the body itself compressed. He rose fast despite training, fear breaking every drilled instinct. We hauled equipment back shaking. Hydrophones dripped seawater, no different to the eye. We tested playback on deck. Half the reels carried nothing but blank hiss, static wiped as though scrubbed clean. Segments erased without trace. The other half carried normal deep hum, safe, boring, void of anomaly. Only the thin minutes we most needed gone. The diver sat with towel crushed against his chest, describing the sensation again, quieter this time. Like someone's hand inside my ribs, he muttered. Not the sea. The sea presses outside. This was inside, all at once, like being seized. His stare fixed on the floor, refusing to meet my eye. I jotted frantic notes in the salt, damp ledger. Event at 500 meters plus. Piercing tone captured briefly. Immediate silence. Diver reports non-biological pressure shifts internal. Post-retrieval. Tapes degraded, half-wiped. Anomaly avoids direct evidence. The conclusion chilled as much as the experience. It was not only elusive, it evaded capture, as though resisting observation by design. A survival instinct of something vast. A refusal to be preserved. Night swallowed sea after return. Sitting with ruined reels spread across cabin desk, I rewound again. Every pass carried the same answer. Empty static where proof should live. Not loss, but rejection. My hand trembled, scribbling last line. Resistance greater than revelation. The trench does not allow to be seen. I set the feet up cautiously, cables routed through the satellite uplink, and outward again into the recorder chain. The gear hummed with subdued life. Monitors crawling with baseline hum from hydrophones dropped into the trench zone. At first everything held as expected. Deep droning currents, distant clicks I logged as sonar scatter, occasional whale lowing. Reliability mattered more than content. I wanted continuity, something no one could dismiss later as accidental cutoff. For 40 minutes, the feed stayed steady. I wrote long strings of numbers across the notebook, times to the second, amplitude ranges, all dull and methodical. I almost convinced myself nothing abnormal would arrive. Sometimes anticipation itself creates more tension than the evidence. I found a rhythm in the writing, calm broken only by headset fatigue. Without transition, the feed collapsed. Not gradual fading, not buffering stalls. One moment, normal ocean bed rumble. The next, blank screen. Waveforms straight, black, neither sound above nor sound below. A full deletion replacing signal. I flipped to hard drives, scanning emergency mirrors. Each bore the same gaps exactly aligned. Zero data, not silence measured, but silence manufactured. 40 minutes and 16 seconds of life, then nothing, as though carved from existence. The headphones still whispered. Where logical recordings ended, my ears teased artifacts. Faint, crawling murmurs beneath the black. Not sound, but something wearing its form. Whispers without words, brushing soft as insect legs in the empty band. I lunged closer, volume high enough to sting. The whispers didn't resolve, but they repeated, twisting like suggestions of language caught at bone edge. I logged my reaction clumsy. Feed vanished abrupt. Gaps mirrored. Under static, persistent whisper elements. Description lacks clarity. Subjective impression voice, like, I called the engineer despite his reluctance. He arrived late, shoulders heavy like regret. His expression told me he'd broken his own word by returning. Still he sat by the monitor, tapping commands with stiff fingers. He examined metadata first, scrolling hex dumps. Suddenly his posture straightened, pale. The drives contained no usable checksum. Instead, each erased segment replaced with repeating hex values, a mirrored code impossible under normal conditions. It wrote back into its absence, he whispered. I felt my neck tighten. Something had not only replaced sound, but revised the structure carrying it, rewriting fundamental scaffolding. The erasure itself spoke. He rubbed weary eyes, voice low with tension. Someone or something wanted this removed but not gone. More like leaving a mark. He snapped the terminal shut, unwilling to watch further. Hours passed with me alone again. Ears pricked raw from listening into void. The whispers lingered stubborn under the black windows of waveform, as if mocking my need for proof. I pressed headphones tight until skull ached, repeating to myself that silence should never grow. Yet silence grew. It crawled with shape and intent. I closed the log with final lines jagged in ink. Phenomena not constrained to sound medium. Exists in data level. Rewrites storage in real time. Even absence remains presence. Presence closer at every removal dot at first. I thought the rumble was passing freight. The windows quivered with low vibrations, steady, unhurried, almost beneath hearing. But when I checked, no trains cut through town that late, and the ground carried no seismic record. The towers on the ridge, red beacons flashing steady over rooftops, stood lit. From them came the sound, though no one admitted it. Nights that followed grew heavier. Each time the towers pulsed, glassware shivered in cupboards, frames tapped gently on the walls. Yet sirens never sounded. Power authorities denied disruptions. The town learned to half ignore it. Mothers tugged curtains closed and claimed imagination. Children complained only in restless dreams. The fishermen spoke louder. Down at the harbor, they handed me complaints over engines not running smooth, sonar falling into weird croaks. One man grabbed my wrist and swore his late wife's voice called faintly through his navigation unit, words soft as tide. Another described his father mocking him from below, though the old man had died decades past. They looked ashamed after confessing, but relief filled their faces when I noted everything. I lined up the times against my trench logs. Inevitably, the disturbances fell on nights the deep bands had burned brightest. The correlation wrote itself. The system had grown outward. It no longer sat isolated below water lines, but threaded into circuitry, pulling human instruments into its rhythm. Back in the apartment, I recorded long tapes of the silence between knocks. Sometimes, crouched still in night, I felt the plaster of my walls thrum faint beneath my palm. Neighbors insisted no shaking woke them. They shrugged, smiled, insisted I must have poor wiring. But the tape caught overlapping hum, same as the trench signal. Identical spacing, identical harmonic peaks. The idea blindsided me. The ocean had been a container, its abyss holding vigilant mouth shut. Now it bled across mediums man had built for convenience. Communications towers, local receivers, home wiring. Each pulse seeding further, the recordings played back with clarity that frightened me. My ceiling light trembled in the same rhythm as the hum inside headphones. Ambient resonance bending timbers and steel screws of the frame. Air itself bending to an order not its own. I logged briskly, pen tips tearing paper from pressure. Encroachment event confirmed. Field not contained. Correlation to human infrastructure verified. The conclusion hit like cold seawater in lungs. There was no wall strong enough. The migration already rooted itself too deep. Once embedded across relay systems, containment would never scale. Not when the very act of transmission seemed to be the conduit. I shut off lights and let the room vibrate, forcing myself to sit and listen as flooring quaked soft. I could not deny it, could not rationalize fuss. The signal had left its trench. Now it lived in the bones of the town, and in me. The envelope was slipped under my door without knock or pretense. Plain paper, unmarked, no return. Inside, a transcript folded into 4 creases, typed with the faded hiss of an old ribbon machine. My breath caught when I spread it across the desk. The heading gave nothing away, Marine Systems Review. Internal circulation only. The participants had titles, never names. Initials redacted with black, so heavy it tore the paper. I read slowly, line by line. The language held the same evasive tone I had learned to fear. They never named what they studied, never dared call it sound. They spoke instead in bent phrases, dark responses, threshold interference, cost of exposure. Each sentence danced around the subject as though words themselves might trigger it. Across pages, the theme repeated. Funding would be reduced. Expeditions curtailed. The justification, safety concerns not elaborated here. Every line tightened the knot in my chest. What they rendered as oversight amounted to retreat. I checked the date sharply, 1973. The same season NASA diverted from its ocean mapping division, folding research into sky-bound budgets. I had rung that historical bell before, assumed finance or politics. But here the hidden reason pulsed clear, reaction. Deep probes had sent signals, and something down there had answered. These panels spoke of escalation, but cloaked in bureaucracy. One line, faint along page 3. cut raw through their hedging. Less exposure equals less reply. I leaned back stunned, pen sliding from my grip. They knew. They had heard it answer. And instead of pushing deeper, they gagged themselves, sealed the record. Silence not as ignorance, but as bargain. As I read, wind thickened outside. Rain tapped quick against roof tin, then slammed harder. The building shuddered under downpour. I tried to ignore it, but the recording machine caught everything. Tapes rolled beside me, red diode blinking calm as the storm devoured the street. Hours later, on playback, my spine locked. The rainfall did not translate clean as weather. Between clusters, hiss thickened, coiling like voice. Syllables surfaced subtle, but enough. Strung under rain were the shapes of my own name, hissed again and again. I replayed, adjusting filters, though no filter had placed it there. Each time the same. Rain syllables matched to rhythm of my speaking voice, spelling me out. My pulse thumped heavy, then dropped hollow. I sat frozen, listening as storm recited me. Proof layered ugly against ugly. The panel had silenced warning not to protect, but to trade existence for ignorance. Their hush an agreement that left civilians deaf by choice. The rain hammered louder, greater than it should have been, rattling plaster until nails ticked in timber. I pressed both palms to the desk to keep from shaking. Final notes scrawled rough by pen. Silence adopted as pact. Proof of reply recorded. Name returned. Complicity confirmed. I closed my eyes, hearing rain adjust again into hiss. Flowing now like dialogue. Each drop another syllable wound into me. Something waited beneath silence, growing bold while institutions chose to smother truth. It began with a flicker on the FM dial, just past midnight. I was scanning late-night shows, half awake, writing stray notes, when the host's chatter slipped into distortion. At first I thought it was their transmitter coughing in bad weather. Then it tore open wider. Every meter on my console leapt. Needles slammed against red and stayed there, refusing to retreat. Static roared through the headphones, packed so full it almost resembled layers of song. Behind the noise spread a chorus, not quite voices yet too human to dismiss. Dozens, maybe hundreds, woven into a throbbing choir. The bloom swelled, unstoppable, cracking through every channel I tested. AIM news folded into the same drone. Shipping weather cut to harmonic moans. A baby monitor I kept for comparison spat not cries, but pure resonance, watered in dreadful beauty. Every circuit I owned vibrated in simultaneous unity. The apartment itself joined. Dishes rattled in cupboards. The floor hummed like struck glass. My microphone showed peaks jagged and unending, red blocks across its entire range. 30 seconds on the clock, yet inside those 30 seconds my perception folded long. The sound terrified. It pressed close against chest and jaw, riding bone instead of ear. But woven behind terror was warmth, a curve-like embrace. A familiarity I could not accept, yet could not deny. The choir bent into memory, spilling illusions. Faces drowned long ago rose within the cadence. Water pressed over me, though I sat dry. Later I learned I wasn't alone. Reports spread quickly, listeners dazed, struggling to describe recollections that weren't theirs. A sailor recalled drowning, though he'd never fallen overboard. A woman swore she inhaled ocean water warm as blood, though she sat safe at her desk. The bloom left each of us carrying something not native. Through the swarm I kept narrating, keeping voice low, though it barely threaded across the drag of resonance. I spoke for tape, event global, every channel at once, rhythmic bloom like body flexing. My words trembled, not from lack of breath, but from awe, because at last it felt intentional. Not stray coincidence. No resistance, no evasive bending. The thing beneath and above had simply chosen a moment to cast itself everywhere at once. When the bloom cut off, silence struck merciless. Air fell still. Consoles blinked routine as though nothing had happened. Meters dropped inert. FM hosts resumed mid-sentence, oblivious they had been carriers. The baby monitor clicked back to empty household murmur. No one acknowledged possession. I sat hunched, sweat salt against my lips, hands crusted to notebook edges. I whispered my final thought onto tape with voice nearly lost. For the first time it no longer hides. The ocean has opened its mouth wider than ever, and once open, mouths do not always close. They moved fast once the bloom hit. Agencies that had spent decades pretending nothing was wrong turned frantic overnight. Towers ordered down. Repeaters shut silent. Satellite bands listed temporary maintenance. Emergency notices scrolled across screens with vague language, technical upgrades, routine adjustments. In reality, it was panic hidden as procedure. For a night the airwaves grew quieter than I'd ever heard before. Dials spun empty, white hiss gutted, whole spectrums vacant. On paper at least, silence had been sealed. But sitting at my console in the dark, my equipment still on battery, I heard traces. Under the blackout bands, tiny threads threaded through. Low hum at edges, faint pulses crawling where nothing official transmitted. I logged times and peaks, voice dry. Each attempt at silence created more concentrated residue, as though pressing palms against water only forced it harder through cracks. The engineer sat across from me, gaunt under weak desk light. His tone stayed tired but firm. Cutting doesn't kill. It redirects. Pressure finds gaps. He tapped on the copper mesh we had tacked around meters, the shielding meant to choke interference. At best, this buys minutes. We tested. Wrapped lines thick with copper braid, layered foil sheets around the recorder cabinet, grounded every loop back into dust-dry radiator pipes. For a moment, the bands dipped flat. My chest loosened as though calm might return. Then the static reformed. Not in old channels, but tucked into altered bands. Sliding just out of range where we hadn't thought to listen, we chased it like fools. Each layer of defense birthed new adjustments. Harmonics bent, squeezed thinner, sharper, adapting fluid. I kept voice log running, documenting the futility with ink-stained fingertips. Fear laced each word. The engineer pressed headphones to his ears, expression hollow. He muttered, "It learns," though he didn't want to admit it. I knew then he would not stay for long. The futility weighed too heavy. The clocks tumbled toward dawn. Both of us leaned slack in chairs, copper mesh sagging like foil armor around barn-built consoles, every trick spent. The studio air tasted metallic, stiff with stale electricity and sweat. We did not try another test. The hum lingered faint under silence like heartbeat you cannot tune out. My eyelids hurt with exhaustion. He stared down at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. Neither of us wanted to speak first, because saying truth out loud would press it irrevocable. I wrote final note instead, hand cramping. Sealing proves futile. Cutting feeds sharpens presence. Past retreats only quicken migration. Silence never worked. When I put the pen down, he looked up at last. His eyes carried emptiness and private terror. We sat through first light saying nothing, mouths sealed as tightly as the agencies outside. But both of us knew efforts to contain had never worked, not once. The only question now was whether every retreat across decades had been nothing more than an invitation for the signal to root itself deeper. I thought I had learned how to separate noise from life. That was the one guard left, the division between archive and memory. Tonight that boundary shredded. The tape clicked into motion as usual. My notebooks lined the desk, pens sharp, recorder angled to pick up every drag of hiss. At first it carried nothing unusual, low static, wavering pulses, a faint hum like the slow breathing of a buried thing. I prepared to log more numbers and arcs. But then a sound surfaced that stopped my hand halfway down the page. It was laughter. Not rough distortion, true laughter, curling high and bright. My sister's, but not as I ever recorded her. The sound lifted from the tape sudden, with the raw warmth of childhood. I could hear chairs scraping wood behind it, a clatter of plates, the vague blur of holiday voices. A scene I had lived in memory, not machine. The pen slipped from my hand. Air left my chest and refused to come back. I gripped the headphones until the padding hurt, pressing them tight to reassure myself it was there. Tears blurred the page as she laughed again. Then came my mother's voice, calling me inside from some summer dusk. I hadn't heard it in years. Firm, shaped with patience that always carried edges. She called my name as she did when I hid outside past dinner, pretending bugs or clouds mattered more than table talk. But these recordings never existed. I had no reels of family dinners, no samples of childhood. Yet here they played, folded into trench hiss as though the signal had learned to mine what only I remembered. I broke, listening, every nerve raw. Documenting had always been shield, the thing that softened terror with procedure. Tonight it bound me tighter, because to log was to relive. Writing down her laughter made it audible once more in my ears. Calling my mother's words, captured, only forced them deeper inside. My tears fell heavy onto the notebook until ink ran into pools. I muttered a loud, hoarse, barely audible, "Stop, stop." The headphones ignored me. The intrusion grew unbearable, a form of intimacy I hadn't chosen but couldn't deny. It felt weaponized, but also gifted, as though grief had been turned into channel. As though something inside the noise offered me memories not to torture, but to tether me. I thought then, maybe grief itself had been the door. My cracks the entry point. Without my ache, perhaps there wouldn't be a path for memory to slip. Or perhaps grief was always the system's requirement. A wound pulling resonance across from whatever archive held unfinished voices. I forced myself to note the timestamp despite shaking fingers. 2:15 a.m., laughter emerging, mother's voice sustained at low amplitude. Writing the line brought no comfort. It cut deeper. As pen carved, I felt the sound fold around me, layering into memory of this moment tonight merging with old nights, all catalogued under the same sheet. Fear clawed at me suddenly. That the recording not only carried my family, but now carried me. That by acknowledging, by time-stopping, I had granted it one more file to index my own whisper, saying stop, my tears landing on pages. My pulse low and unguarded. I sat frozen, headphones still clasped, listening as the voices thinned back into hiss. Nothing remained but faint wash of static. Yet I couldn't shake the sense I had been archived in return. The tape kept rolling, endless in its hunger. I stared into the diode, dread rising steady. Because if it could reach backward to give me what I lost, then nothing stopped it from reaching forward. From keeping me somewhere I had no way to leave. The coordinates hid in corrupted metadata, nested among hex strings left behind after the vanishing feed. At first they looked like random noise, broken bytes rearranged. But the repetition betrayed them, numbers reshaped into a location near a forgotten wedge of coast. I stared at the sequence for hours, refusing to confirm. Yet by dusk, exhaustion gave way to compulsion, and I packed my recorder, notebooks, and a single flashlight. The drive took me through roads narrowed by pine. The nearer I came, the fewer lights marked the horizon. Salt thickened the air, even with windows shut, and the smell of rust clung to road signs stripped near blank. The station itself stood hunched on rocks, paint long lost to storms. Its antenna tilted like a crooked rib. Inside smelled of paper rot and brine. Dust filmed every desk, chairs collapsed under their own weight. Yet machines hummed low, impossibly steady, green indicators still pulsing faint as eyes in dark. I felt my stomach seize at the sight of reels turning without hands, tape spooling in careful rotations. Blank rooms, but recordings alive. I drew closer. Headphones in place, microphone monitoring. The reels spoke in click short pairs, then pause, then repeat. Not sonar measuring distance, but something more deliberate. A rhythm insistent and slow, like knuckles tapping on the door of bone. Each sequence repeated with such patience it almost felt merciful. I narrated aloud, voice scratching dry. My words trembled caught between wonder and dread. I logged, autonomous reels engaged. Signal steady, repeating clicks beyond random scatter. Possible directive. I stood still in empty room, floorboards giving faint underweight. Hours of listening passed. At last, the compulsion drove me to check the recording I had spoken only minutes earlier. On playback, my own footsteps filled the tape, but slower, stretched heavy like muscles underwater. Then my voice entered, bent backwards. Half phrases reversed as though someone on the other end pulled the tape the wrong way. My skin flared cold. Not only echo, but bleed. Proof that line between present and record weakened in this place. Noise did not wait for storage. It invaded live. I stared at the reels winding smooth circles. Their needles dipped and rose in tiny arcs, returning each time to perfect baseline. I removed headphones, half hoping the clicks would fade. But in the silence of the room, my ears still caught faint taps from walls and floor. As though the building carried rhythm itself, I pressed palm flat to console. Felt steady vibration pulse back a human heartbeat, stretched thin, foreign, yet impossibly familiar. I whispered my sister's name before I could stop. Myself. At once the next series of clicks quickened. I yanked hand away, chest hammering. The station was aware. That became fact. This was no passive archive. It had registered my presence, adjusted, leaned closer when I leaned close. Dawn dragged gray through broken slats of shutters. Dust swirled but shimmered as if heavy with sea spray. I had not closed my eyes all night. Each minute pressed decision heavier on me. I could still withdraw, shut machines down, scatter power supply to salt air. Nothing forced me except myself. Yet the lure pulled stronger than fear. The sensation that all I had hunted for lived now between these reels, waiting. Not to witness, but to invite. Everything in the clicks insisted. Come further. Lean closer. Hear us. My breath felt sharp, lungs scraped raw. I pulled headphones tight over skull, bent near machine, and let tape spin louder into my head. My final note spoke barely above whisper, yet microphone drank every syllable. Choice clear before me. Silence or invitation. I lowered the headphones further. Breath breaking fast, pulled unwilling yet ready to hear what waited in the clicks. The vessel held steady over black water. Instruments trembling at their edges as though the sea itself strained against them. I had convinced myself there was no turning back, not after the signals had crept into every corner of life. To retreat now would mean you can wall off oceans with paper. The trench waited below, ink without measure. Cables rattled out. Hydrophones traced descent past their safety clasp. At 300 meters, vibration thickened. At 500, frames of the vessel groaned like joints pressed against too much bone. I gripped microphone with shaking fingers, speaking every depth aloud, though each syllable sounded brittle. Then the sound arrived. Not syllables, not rhythm. A pure vibration, low thunder pressed through steel, trembling every bolt of hull. The vessel keened. My ribs hummed as though tuned. I tried to speak again, but tape hiss swallowed words before they left my throat. The recorder fought to stay alive, meters spiking then blanking white. Heat of panic surged. I slapped hand against console, as if physical contact mattered against collapse of language. Catastrophe loomed. Then, sudden, the world stopped. For seconds there was nothing. Not static, not engine, not sea. Every channel went mute, a hollow strike of absence. It felt unnatural, a pause cut into creation. The silence opened wider, frightening in its perfection. Then came the surge. One last swell through all metal. Static grew, thrashed white, then folded onto itself. And in that chaos formed a sentence. Not clear as voice, but carved by resonance into something unavoidably understood. It wasn't command. It wasn't plea. It was acknowledgement. As if abyss and listener recognized each other finally. My chest collapsed with its weight. Grief twisted into connection. Terrible and holy. Above. Agencies declared blackout. Feeds silenced. Notices scripted neat. Public never knew. Official logs sealed. Yet my own handheld recorder shook beside me. Cassette wheel grinding slow. When I rewound after return, the fragments still lived there. Faint but permanent. I played it again as night drowned windows of the apartment. Again, each time same impact. A wordless sentence of recognition, sitting between terror and embrace. It altered nothing, in fact. It altered everything in heart. Final notes, shaky in notebook. Ink smudged by sweat. Ocean still speaks. Will always speak. And I am no longer certain silence was ever ours to choose.